we're going to be discussing and hopefully mutually learning about the myths that we have been sold in the last roughly 200 years. Myths like, oh, ingesting fluoride is good for your teeth. Or myths like the Civil War was fought over slavery. Now, since both of those are relatively old myths, and my interests currently lie along the lines of the myths that are currently being created, I expect that we're going to be going in a variety of directions. And I just glanced over at the clock, so I think I'm about on time on this. I told my grandson, I am Paul Meyer, by the way. I'm a retired anesthesiologist, I'm a retired theologian, and I'm a constant student. If you want to know anything else about me, you're going to have to ask. I told my grandson that I made a point of making a mistake every quarter because it was the only way I could stay humble. One of the mistakes I made this quarter was describing this class and going through the list of myths that Americans and Westerners in general have been asked to swallow. And I realized after getting close to the end of the list that I had convinced her that either the amount of material was entirely too mammoth and she didn't want to get involved, or I was absolutely crazy and she didn't want to get involved. There is a tremendous emotional energy barrier to looking at things as they are. Let me ask a general question. Did anyone in here, probably in their early or mid-teens, if they were lucky, or in their late teens or early 20s, have a relative or a close friend sit down and tell you how the world was really running? Anybody have that? Good for Janet. I didn't. The vast majority of us did not. John Taylor Gatto was the New York State Teacher of the Year in 1991, and if memory serves me correctly, he was New York City Teacher of the Year for 1989 and 90 as well. He retired by writing a letter in the Wall Street Journal, and the title of the letter was, "I Quit. I Think." And he basically said he no longer wanted to be involved in hurting children by the way they were being taught. To his astonishment, he subsequently has a career as a lecturer and a consultant in terms of teaching. Some of the people in this who have been with me in sessions past will recognize two of the videos that I'm about to show you. But I don't want to overwhelm you with all kinds of material. I will share with you where I intend to go with this class. It seems to me that we are remarkably stupid, and I want to understand how we as Americans in particular and Westerners in general, because I've talked with students in Europe and they're not nearly as misinformed and uninformed as Americans. Those especially in the Scandinavian countries, I was absolutely delighted to find out how well they understood the political and economic system in which they were growing up. It might be the reason why they are so politically impotent. And the reason I say it that way is that the people who understand what is going on either endorse the system and become a part of it, or they become rebels and decide to oppose it. And to my great pleasure, the young people I was talking with understood what was going on and were opposing it. Let me give you a simple example. You may be aware that in 2014, the United States sponsored a coup d'etat in Ukraine. Now that's not what you will hear in the American newspaper, but it is what is clearly documentable with all kinds of information. The people who became in charge of the government of Ukraine subsequently attacked the people who opposed that coup d'etat in southeastern Ukraine. The people in eastern and southeastern Ukraine are ethnically perhaps 75, in some areas 95% Russian in terms of their ethnic origin. There certainly are Russian speakers. And the prime minister, I think that was his office, who was expelled in the coup d'etat, was his political base was in the south and east of Ukraine. He got some votes from the western and northern part, but his political base was in the southeast. And he was tossed out. He literally fled for his life and fled to Russia. The long and short of it is the people who are subsequently reigning in Kiev, in the Ukrainian capital, hate Russia and they hate Russians. And they hate anyone who is pro-Russian. So they attacked the pro-Russians in the east and south. And for the more Nazified members of them, what they were intending to do is ethnically cleanse. They wanted the territory without the people, and they were going about that. To their chagrin, the pro-Russian rebels were much more effective at fighting back than they expected them to be. The point that I am going to make, however, is that in terms of understanding the political situation, the rebels were accumulating volunteers from the rest of Europe and presumably from other parts of the world. But in the process of accumulating volunteers, they were sorting out ringers because they were fairly confident that there were some people who were trying to infiltrate from the rest of Ukraine. So they used as a test question, what happened on 9/11/2001 in the United States? If they got the answer that 19 Arabs attacked the United States, they were tossed out. They were either incredibly stupid or they were ringers. If they said the United States and somebody else cooperated in that venture, then they were presumably reasonably intelligent and they were presumably pro-Russian. So they were accepted as volunteers in this rebel organization. I'm not saying anything in particular about the Ukrainian coup d'etat or the rebels right now. I'm pointing that out as evidence that understanding what's going on is a very sound foundation for understanding what you want to do about it. About a half a year ago, I was having a discussion with a very intelligent lady, and I said, we are getting very close to the point where people need to decide what they're willing to go to jail over. And she's a very nice lady, quite intelligent. And she said, I'm not willing to go to jail over anything. I'm not in that situation. I have a lot of quarrel with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but I understand the desperation from which you, if you don't know the history of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I encourage you to look it up in Wikipedia. But he got to the point in Nazi Germany where he felt he had to do something about an oppressive regime. And we got troubles right here in River City. For those of you who are new, I'm going to play two videos that come reasonably close to depicting what the class is about. For those of you who have seen it before, I beg your indulgence and invite you to join it and to enjoy it.
Do you know what I'm talking about? Matrix. Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
The next video I was able to copy from a British television station. At one point in time it was available on YouTube, but it was fairly quickly removed. And as you see it, you'll understand why. It's a metaphor or an allegory of the system or systems that are actually managing the United States economy, the world political system. As I say, it's an allegory, so there is not a one-for-one correlation, but there is a very sound connection between the play, the reason it will not be shown in the United States, and the reason I'm showing it now. It's entitled Playhouse Presents the Man. It is such a good metaphor for the way the world is actually being run that I want to point out a few places where it is actually wrong. The man said, we're trying to avert wars and promote prosperity. Well, he was offering a sop to the new member because sometimes it is the fomenting of wars that precipitates prosperity for other people. The Veterans for Peace have put out a very good little, I'll call it a comic book because there are illustrations, but it's not comic at all, on America's addiction to war and to violence. And I was really impressed when I went through it page by page at how good it is. And I'm going to pass around 3 books. One is called Why People Believe Weird Things. The other is called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And the last has a very strange title called Political Ponerology. Why People Believe Weird Things is a book written to channel your thinking. It's written in order for you to be instructed certain ideas are out of bounds. They're taboo. You just, if you're going to be a member of decent society, you don't entertain this, that, or the other thought. And I invite you to look at the number of weird things that now some things, language is very interesting from a variety of perspectives. Language teaches you not only what other people are thinking, but it is, depending on how it is used, it tells you what you should and shouldn't think. If I wanted to devote the time to it, I've got a nice little clip of Walter Cronkite. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Walter Cronkite reports what the Soviet KGB interpretation of Kennedy's assassination was. And the Soviet interpretation of it was that it was a well-organized plot, that you could not achieve the assassination of the American president without a well-organized plot and the cooperation of a number of people. And when Cronkite announced that, he made it perfectly clear, both by his body language and by his word per se, that this was Soviet propaganda that he wanted the public to be aware of, but he wanted the public to be absolutely certain to know that it wasn't acceptable thinking. As it turns out, 60 years after the fact, it's clear that the Soviet propaganda, or at least the KGB interpretation of the events, was a whole lot closer to reality than what was being peddled about Lee Harvey Oswald. The other book is Lies My Teacher Told Me. This is a convenient book of what was called a limited hangout in the administration of Richard Nixon. A limited hangout is where you give people 60% of valid information and pretend that that is the last of the information, so that when they are satisfied with 60%, they don't continue to ask additional questions. They feel that they've got 100%, and if you are successful at selling that 60%, you can tell them that, and they won't ask any further. It's actually been used a multitude of times in history. One of the other places where the man is clearly lying to the new recruit is when he denies that anybody is cold. In point of fact, in Political Ponerology, it's written by a psychologist from Eastern Europe. And it's written as an analysis of the political leadership in the East and the political leadership in the West. It turns out that somewhere between 3 and 7% of the Western population, because it is culturally, it is capable of influence via cultural pressures, between 3 and 7% of the Western population is sociopathic. They don't feel the feelings of compassion and empathy that your mother told you you should feel for your brother who hurt his arm, or your neighbor whose wife has just died. This 3 to 7% get very good at pretending to have these feelings. And as a matter of fact, they get so good that they get remarkably good at manipulating other people. Tragically, because they are so good at manipulating other people, they also tend to migrate to positions of substantial leadership, be that in industry, be that in banking, be that in the media, or be that in politics. So that you have the natural migration of sociopathic individuals to positions of power. So when the man was denying that the people who are managing the world are not cold, he was lying just as much as when he said they were trying to avoid war. Because war is clearly, World War I was fought for the benefit of industrialists and bankers. I don't ask you to believe that at this point, but it's relatively easily demonstrated. Now let's see, what other points? Political ponerology. Those who have been in this class before are aware that 9/11/2001 was, I'll call it an inside job, although there was profound cooperation from another nation state. I'm not particularly asking you to believe that today. I'm in the process of finding out where you, my fellow students, are, because I'll do my very best to present information that is at the forefront of where you are. Now, in terms of 9/11, those who have been here before have seen a great deal of the evidence and don't need to be convinced. Some of you who have not been here before may need to be convinced. And I want to show you a video clip that James Corbett has put out. He's put out half a dozen or so of people who he has intentionally highlighted their involvement in 9/11 as demonstrable of the evil that is embodied in that particular event. For better and for worse, the world and the United States has already abandoned, for all practical purposes, the war on terror. They now have a new boogeyman in the person of Vladimir Putin and Russia, and sitting in the background, China. But for 10 to 15 years, the war on terror was the reason for being, the raison d'etre of the military-industrial complex, the surrender of civil rights in the United States, the Patriot Act, the two National Defense Authorization Acts, the militarization of the police. I don't want to go into a long list. At this point, I want to show you that that was inherent in the events of 9/11, and even people who look to have been playing good roles were, the best you can say, the very best you can say, is that they were criminally negligent. Because this particular video is about Christine Todd Whitman, if I hope I have the full name correct, who was head of the Federal Emergency Management? No. The ecological management of the disaster of 2001. Sometimes I get my titles and names screwed up. I apologize for that. The World Trade Center towers were albatrosses. They were so loaded with asbestos that to bring them down, they were economically a disadvantage in 2001. And to bring them down by controlled demolition in an organized fashion would have been remarkably costly because they were loaded with asbestos, they were loaded with computers. The refuse from their destruction would be a toxic waste dump in Lower Manhattan. With that knowledge as background, I want you to listen and watch this.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
EPA.
The Dust Lady photo has become one of the iconic images of 9/11. The image of a woman, shocked and disoriented, completely covered in dust from the demolition of the Twin Towers, brings the nearly incomprehensible events of that day down to a human scale. But of course, the Dust Lady was not the only one to feel the effects of the blanket of dust that descended on Manhattan after the towers fell. In the hours, days, and weeks that followed, thousands upon thousands of victims, first responders, emergency personnel, cleanup crews, and residents were subjected to the poisonous stew of asbestos, benzene, mercury, lead, cadmium, and other particulates, from which many are now dying.
Dr. David Prezant, Chief Medical Officer with the New York Fire Department, spent 7 years examining more than 10,000 firefighters, those who were at the World Trade Center site after 9/11 and those who weren't.
And we found an increase in all cancers combined, a 19% increase in cancers compared to the non-exposed World Trade Center group.
Talk about the most pressing medical issues facing 9/11 first responders right now.
Cancer. In the beginning, in the first few years, it was respiratory, but now it's cancers. And this is just the first wave of cancers, the blood cancers, the leukemias, the organ cancers. But in 5 to 10 more years, you're going to see the asbestos cancers. There'll be another wave of cancers. And like I tell everybody, this is a generation-long issue and a generation-long illness.
Every morning I wake up, I gotta take 33 pills within the course of the day. At 47 years old, I have lungs of an 80-year-old man that would have been a smoker. People say you have to forget about 9/11. And I say, how could I forget about 9/11 when every morning I gotta take this medication and walk around with an oxygen tank?
If the brave men and women who had rushed to the World Trade Center in the chaotic days after 9/11 to help with the search and rescue had done so knowing the risks they were facing, that would be one thing. But of course they did not. They had been given false assurances by Christine Todd Whitman, the EPA administrator who assured the public just days into the cleanup that the air was safe to breathe.
You know asbestos was in there, is in those buildings, lead is in those buildings. There are the VOCs. However, the concentrations are such that they don't pose a health hazard.
As the weeks and months dragged on, Whitman, the EPA, and its officials made statement after statement after statement reaffirming that contaminant levels were low or non-existent, and that the air quality in Manhattan posed no public health concern. We now know that these reassurances were outright lies. On September 18th, the very same day that Whitman and the EPA were encouraging New Yorkers to return to work, the agency detected sulfur dioxide levels in the air so high that, according to one industrial hygienist, they exceeded the EPA's standard for a classification of hazardous. By that time, first responders were already reporting a range of health problems, including coughing, wheezing, eye irritation, and headaches. The evidence continued to pour in that there were serious health concerns for those in and around Manhattan, but the information was suppressed almost as quickly as it was discovered. When a local lab tested dust samples from near the World Trade Center site and found dangerous concentrations of fiberglass and asbestos, the New York State Department of Health warned local labs that they would lose their licenses if they process any more independent sampling. When U.S. Geological Survey scientists began performing tests on their own dust samples, they were shocked at the alphabet soup of heavy metals they found in it. They forwarded this information to the EPA, but the agency continued to assure the public that there was no evidence of long-term health risks. The drama continued to unfold as information poured in about benzene, lead, and other environmental toxins. Yet on September 18th, the EPA specifically advised the public against wearing respirators outside the World Trade Center restricted area. Then, just 2 weeks later, the agency distributed respirators to their own staffers at the EPA's Region 2 building on Broadway Street. As scientists, industrial hygienists, and even other government officials began to accuse the EPA of covering up the true extent of the problem in New York, the agency continued with its dogged assertion that the air was safe to breathe. It wasn't until 2003 that the EPA's own Inspector General revealed that the White House had been editing the agency's press releases all along, finding that the White House Council on Environmental Quality influenced, through the collaboration process, the information that EPA communicated to the public through its early press releases when it convinced EPA to add reassuring statements and delete cautionary ones. When new documents were released to the public in 2011, on the eve of the 10th anniversary of 9/11, it was discovered that this editing was even worse than originally feared. Outraged at the fact that they had been lied to and their lives put at risk, residents and workers in Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn sued Whitman and the EPA in 2004. In a 2006 ruling allowing the class action lawsuit to proceed, Judge Deborah A. Batts of Federal District Court in Manhattan excoriated Whitman, finding that her baseless assurances that the air was safe increased and may have in fact created the danger to people living and working in the area. Ruling that the EPA did, in fact, make misleading statements of safety about the air quality, Judge Batts said, "The allegations in this case of Whitman's reassuring and misleading statements of safety after the September 11, 2001 attacks are without question conscience-shocking." Batts's decision was overturned by a panel of judges in 2008 who ruled that misleading the public and contributing to the health problems and deaths of untold Ground Zero workers was not conscience-shocking enough to override her immunity from prosecution as a federal agent. If Whitman has a conscience at all, it is evidently not shocked by any of these accusations. She has not only never conceded guilt or even expressed sorrow for the ongoing sickness and deaths that her actions helped bring about, she has repeatedly defended the actions of herself and the EPA in general.
Statements that EPA officials made after 9/11 were based on the judgment of experienced environmental and health professionals at EPA, OSHA, and the CDC who had analyzed the test data that 13 different organizations and agencies were collecting in Lower Manhattan. I do not recall any EPA scientist or experts responsible for reviewing this data ever advising me that the test data from Lower Manhattan showed that the air or water proposed long-term health risks for the general public.
Whitman's lies are not just those of another self-serving politician looking to save their job or stay out of jail. They are the lies of someone who has contributed to the deteriorating health and even the death of thousands of innocent men and women. For the victims of Christine Todd Whitman, the EPA, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and all of the other agencies and officers who lied to the public about the health risks in New York, 9/11 is not a single day of horror that occurred a decade and a half ago. It is a slowly unfolding nightmare, one that every day brings them one step closer to their grave. The Dust Lady is one of the icons of the tragedy of that day. Should it be any surprise then that she too was ravaged by 9/11 related diseases and ultimately died of cancer last year? She was not the first person to die from the aftermath of 9/11. And Thanks to Christine Todd Whitman and the liars at the EPA who have consigned untold thousands to a similar fate, she will not be the last.
My name is David Meyer. On September 11th, 2001, along with hundreds of my fellow troops, I went to Ground Zero. No one asked us, no orders were given. We went because our city, our country, our neighbors were under attack. And we knew what to do, or at least we thought we did. On September 13th, we marched back in groups of 2s and 3s at first, and then dozens until there must have been more than 200 of us, carrying ropes, ladders, tools of every kind, back into the smoke and the poison and rubble where we reached an intersection with hundreds of civilians cheering us on. Our uniforms were torn and soiled. Our resolve was simple: to stay and dig as long as we had any hope to save anybody. I want to tell you about how sick so many of these brave men and women have become. I want to tell you about how the mayor refused to accept the fact that not dozens, not hundreds, but many thousands of us were contaminated, sickened, and poisoned by the most toxic combinations of building materials in the history of disaster relief, and that for 5 terrible years, he ignored that fact. 5 years of our family members watching us drop dead. And every time Popular Mechanics calls the people of this movement nuts, these propagandists, professional liars and tools who cannot, even by any stretch of the imagination, be considered journalists, strike another nail into the coffin of another rescue worker.
I actually figure very largely in a number of the key conspiracy theories.
The fact of the matter is, we are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event.
Now may be the time for me to mention that in the past, from time to time, one or another of the fellow students here, I call you fellow students because I'm still a student, have become offended at what we've discussed or what I have said. One of them became offended because I said that the United States government was involved in some of this evil. Now, if anyone's going to be offended by that kind of statement or evidence to that effect, you're not going to be happy with this course. Another one of them left because I said something quite negative about the nation-state of Israel and its complicity. So if you have a loyalty or an affection for the nation-state of Israel, if you're a Zionist, you're not going to like what goes on here. It's only fair that you know that, because the Zionists have been intimately involved with the industrialists and the financiers and the politicians who are in charge. Do you have any questions? I've either overwhelmed you or totally underwhelmed you.
I just happened to walk in on this today. And this is my first, I think, visit.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah.
I hope you're ready for the trip down the rabbit hole.
You want to find rabbits or minks?
No, but remember, Alice discovered a whole new world that was managed by different rules than what was going on above ground. Well, computer experts think there's a 99.99% probability that all of us are living in a computer-generated matrix. Well, I don't care if I'm living in a computer-generated matrix as long as I can understand what the hell is going on.
I don't even have it.
Okay, I have one other video. I am open to comments and questions, but I wanted people, one of the rules of logic is you cannot have a discussion about any particular premise or proposition if the person with whom you are discussing it has an emotional attachment to one of the two sides of the position. Now, over the course of studying, I have a distinct hostility towards plutocrats. I have a distinct hostility towards Zionists, but not because they're Zionists, but because of their behavior. Not because they have a lot of money, but because of their behavior. And I don't know if that's an emotional attachment or not. I can logically and rationally describe the kind of society I would like to live in, but we're a long way from it. Let me show you the last video that I planned on showing because it demonstrates very nicely how 9/11 has changed the United States that you live in.
And we do have some breaking news that we want to bring you around. We're going to go to a picture, a live picture from New York City.
The plane may have hit one of the two towers.
What do the intelligence people there say about that?
The intelligence community for some time has been warning a steady drumbeat, Brian, that Osama bin Laden has not been heard from now, frankly, since the beginning of the year. The USS.
Some of the key suspects come to mind: Osama bin Laden.
As you've studied him, what can you tell us about him that we don't know? Take us to the core of Osama bin Laden.
To say to the world that this is a unified nation in the face of tragedy.
In places near to where the tragedies are playing out and far away, Americans are trying to figure out what to do in the face of hopeless grief and sympathy and anger.
Some Palestinians are openly delighted over the attacks. Images like these have embarrassed moderate Arabs. They know that they risk hardening world opinion against the Palestinians, and perhaps even against Arabs in general.
The second ranking person at the Defense Department has laid out what he said will be eventually a sustained U.S. military effort. And so what needs to be done is mount a swift, sure, overwhelming military operation that deals with Osama bin Laden and the Taliban because they've been protecting him.
It's a very sophisticated operation.
Oh, you bet. This is serious business. And there's not one of those. There are many of those.
Are you concerned about asbestos contamination?
The health department has done tests, and at this point is not concerned.
We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails.
The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax. Of course we're after Saddam Hussein, bin Laden. He's isolated.
The terrorists attacked us and killed 3,000 of our citizens before we started the freedom agenda in the Middle East. They were... What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing.
The United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
In a limited military action in Libya, in support of an international effort to protect Libyan civilians.
founder and spiritual leader does not end the terror threat. Across America today, heavily armed police bolstered patrols at airports from Boston to Los Angeles.
There are things that are being now done in Heathrow Airport that is an experiment of using iris scan as a way to check into the airport.
Investigations are often slowed by a limit on the reach of federal search warrants.
Mikey Hicks' family says he's been treated like a terror suspect every time he flies. The airlines say he's on a TSA watch list, even though Mikey is just 8 years old.
The CIA admitted that waterboarding was used on terror suspects in 2002 and 2003, but claimed its agents couldn't be prosecuted because they'd been told it was legal.
I don't want the mosque here.
Why don't you want the
mosque? Why? Because I don't want to go through the Constitution. I know the Constitution said that they are spitting in our face, the mosque people.
Our nation is at war against a far-reaching network of violence and hatred, and that we will do whatever it takes to defeat them and defend our country.
I want to finish that statement that was up there before Barack Obama came on. In an age of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. That's the full quotation, and I hope we're approaching it.
We will incarcerate people preventively. Preventive incarceration. Indefinite detention without trial. That's what this is.
Right now, the Bush people are bringing out their mission accomplished sign because they've not only gotten Obama to protect Bush and Cheney and others from any criminal investigation on torture, but he's now gone even further than they did in the protection of unlawful surveillance.
To know that I might not be so eloquent tonight because I'm suffering from a severe case of outrage. Honestly, I can tell you without reservation, I've been throughout this country now, and I've been in a whole lot of airports. And me undressing for TSA at the airport does not enhance my security, and it certainly doesn't protect me, and it doesn't have a darn thing to do about 911.
I just want to leave you with this. We are not the conspiracy theorists. We are those who want to expose the conspirators behind 9/11. So we are the conspirator hunters, not the theorists, the hunters.
And I understood very well that bin Laden was a creation of the CIA, Al-Qaeda was a US intelligence asset, and that what struck me at first was to say, well, if Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda are those responsible for the 9/11 attacks, then my answer would be, who is behind bin Laden and Al-Qaeda?
But you have to see both sides of the argument and make a decision for yourself. That's what it comes down to. And you have to be really open-minded, and you can't lose focus on the fact that the media is deeply involved in perception management. That's the truth. And you know, everybody has to know that war is never a solution for anything. That's essentially what I have to say.
Over the course of the next few weeks, I'm hoping to explain how the American public became so misinformed and uninformed and dumb, including me. And I hope to begin to clarify some of the people and organizations that are managing it, managing the world in which we live. And I hope to point a finger at some of the groups that are involved in pulling the strings on the people who are pulling the strings. And I'm not trying to be obscure on that, but there's substantial evidence that some people have two loyalties, and that that neither one of them is the United States, for example. There are people who will be delighted to prosper as long as the United States functions as their warrior. Smedley Butler, general in the United States Marine Corps, wrote a book called War is a Racket. He said he could teach Al Capone something about managing a mob, because Capone only controlled 3 districts in North Chicago, and Smedley Butler was a henchman for multiple corporations in the Philippines and in Central America. So that's where I hope we go, and I hope you'll be here next week. I will send you all an email so that you have my email. I would encourage you to send me questions and comments, because my inclination is to look at contemporary myths. That is, myths about Ukraine, myths about Syria, myths about Russia, frankly, myths about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. But a great deal has changed in the United States since 9/11. So if I get enough feedback, I'll go back and deal with some of that. But what I really would like is your input, because I'm with you in the rabbit hole. And I hope to see you next week.
I have one question. What you're trying to say is that this whole thing was set up for 9/11? Is that?
9/11 was what people call an inside job.
Okay, but let me, I read a book that was written by Osama bin Laden's eldest son and his wife. And that was the turning point for his son when he realized what was going to happen, and that it was arranged by Osama bin Laden. And that's when he backed away from his father and got his mother out of Afghanistan at that time.
Do you suppose he had some inclination to do that?
Do
you suppose he had some incentive to do that? In the first video after 9/11, Osama bin Laden denied involvement in the attack. Were you aware of that?
Well, I don't know what he denied or why he denied it, but his son certainly felt he was part of it.
I think we should look at some of those things. But I don't think Osama bin Laden was capable of planting thermite charges in the World Trade Center buildings.
So they have found charges there of planted bombs?
The buildings came down by a controlled demolition.
So what did we see on TV with planes flying into it?
Planes are a great cover.
You don't think that a plane could bring you're saying a plane could not bring a tower down?
Well, a plane hit the Empire State Building back around 1959? Didn't bring it down. I can show you drawings, architectural drawings of the World Trade Center. Each of those World Trade Center buildings, we might need to get into this, I see. Each of those buildings had an outer skeleton and an inner skeleton. The inner skeleton was composed of rectangular tubes of iron, that were 4 inches thick at the bottom and something like a quarter of an inch thick at the top. And even if the buildings entirely had fallen down, that skeleton should have been standing straight up 110 stories into the sky, and it wasn't. Yes, I am saying that airplanes did not bring those 3 buildings down.
There's also the speed with which buildings fell and the manner.
World Trade Center 7 fell for the first 2.5 seconds at the acceleration of gravity. Planes can't do that, and World Trade Center 7 wasn't hit by an airplane. You are reading, I will tell you very candidly, you are reading part of the cover story so that people don't start asking questions. Welcome to the rabbit hole.
Well, why did his son feel that he was responsible?
Why have so many people passed away who had contrary stories? Why did Danny Casolaro die of suicide? Why did the DC madam die of suicide when she was absolutely determined not to commit suicide? The number of people who have died of accidents or suicide because they had contrary information is really quite astonishing.
You know, maybe a simple case will make it serve. If you knock
I'm sorry?
If you knock down a very large tree, which is composed entirely of wood, I don't care what part of it you go after, the base or halfway up, it's going to lean and fall. It's not going to be anywhere near at the speed of gravity, above gravity speed, without something in the way.
What our new member is pointing out is that the form, the manner in which all 3 buildings fell is classic for controlled demolition and is not classic for buildings that collapse due to fire. In fact, in the history of modern steel and concrete construction, no building has fallen due to fire. In the history of modern, in fact, I'll tell you a little vignette about myself. I was a very good chemist before becoming a quite good theologian and then before becoming an excellent anesthesiologist. And what started me on this pathway was a simple piece of information having to do with statistics. In the history of modern construction, steel and concrete construction, 3 buildings have fallen reportedly due to fire. No other building, 3. And all 3 fell on the same day. As a scientist and as a chemist, that rings a bell in my head and says, that ain't the real story. Yep. I can show you 10 films of buildings that are brought down by controlled demolition. And I can show you especially the collapse of World Trade Center 7. World Trade Centers 1 and 2 were so large that there are some, what I think of as minor differences, but they all 3 come down. It's a shame that the people who did it can't advertise, because that was a marvelous exercise in controlled demolition, but they can't advertise it. But I can interpose films of those 3 buildings collapsing and put them in a dozen other films of controlled demolition, and you won't be able to tell me which are the World Trade Center buildings. Those buildings came down by controlled demolition. As I say, welcome to the rabbit hole. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will be entertaining your suggestions when you get my email address.
I don't get one.